Buenas tardes, muchachos y muchachas. My name is Javier and welcome back to Tool Craze. With many power tool brands having their own set of cordless nailers, we got cordless nailers from Bosch, DeWalt, Makita, Ryobi Rigid, and now Porter Cable. I was starting to wonder when Milwaukee was going to come out with their own set of cordless nailers. But sure enough, we got the announcement earlier this year that they're coming out with not just one, but 4 new cordless nailers. They're coming out with an 18-gauge nailer, 2 16-gauge nailers, one with a straight magazine and the other with an angled magazine. And the 4th model is a 15-gauge angled finish nailer. And in this video, we're going to take a look at their 18-gauge brad nailer and the 16-gauge angled finish nailer. One of the sweet things about these new nailers is that they're M18 Fuel Nailers. With fuel meaning that they are their premium power tool offerings with brushless motors and all their best and latest technology. As we could see from their other M18 Fuel power tools, they usually offer high performance in their category along with great runtime, and that's thanks to their brushless motors. In fact, Milwaukee makes some impressive claims saying that their nailers can get up to 700 to 1200 nails driven on a single battery charge depending on the model that was used. And that's with their compact 2.0 amp hour batteries. You can expect to get up to 1200 nails per charge on the M18 Fuel 18-gauge nailer, up to 800 nails on either 16-gauge M18 Fuel nailers, and up to 700 nails driven on the heavy-hitting M18 Fuel 15-gauge nailer. So these new nailers can put down just as many nails with their compact batteries as some of the other non-brushless nailers on the market with their largest batteries. For example, the Ryobi Airstrike 18-volt 18-gauge nailer can get up to 1000 nails driven, but that's with their largest 4 amp hour battery. The Porter Cable 18-volt 18-gauge nailer gets up to 1300 nails driven per charge, but once again that's with their largest 4 amp hour battery. Slap a 4 amp hour battery in the new Milwaukee nailers and you can expect up to twice as much nails driven compared to the 2 amp hour battery, or even better with their 5 amp hour battery. Probably one of the best features of these new M18 Fuel nailers is that there's literally no ramp up time between shots. With other cordless nailers such as the Ryobi and Rigid models, there was about a split second between the trigger being pressed and the nail being fired. They weren't what I would call slow as they were still pretty fast, but the nail fires weren't instant as they are with pneumatic nailers. I've also tried out DeWalt's cordless nailers and while they do fire instantly, you have to first let the motor ramp up before firing. So while the nail firing is instant, it could only be done after the motor was already running. So there's still a bit of a delay between the motor ramping up and the actual nail fire itself. They do offer a pretty cool bump fire mode where you press and hold the trigger, and that lets the motor run in between shots so you still get instant nail fires upon making contact with the material. Now check out how these new Milwaukee nailers fire. So I'm making contact with the material and yet there's no motor ramping up. Now check out what happens when I press the trigger. It fires each nail instantly. Notice how there's no ramp up time and there's pretty much no lag in between shots. Milwaukee also makes a claim that these new nailers can shoot into solid oak and yet still be able to drive each and every nail sub-flush. So here let me give you guys a quick demonstration. So here I made a mock-up wall using a 2x12 on the bottom, a slab of drywall in the center, and a couple of baseboards. All of my projects so far have been using MDF molding, so I included some that I had laying around, and a red oak piece of trim below that so we could see how these nailers do on hardwoods. And I also included a piece of oak from a pallet that I took apart, since Milwaukee's claims are using these nailers with oak. So starting off with the 18-gauge nailer, here's a few shots in the MDF trim. With every shot being fired sunk below the surface. Then let's move on to the red oak trim. And I'm still getting every shot sunk below the surface. And now let's move on to the 1/2-inch oak. And of course the same consistent results. Now let's try the same test again with the 16-gauge angled finish nailer, starting off with the MDF trim. Then moving on to the red oak. And then finally the 1/2-inch oak. So just like the 18-gauge nailer, it sunk each and every nail just below the surface. And just to do a heavy-duty stress test, I built a solid block of hardwood made up of several layers of oak just to see how each nailer handles firing as a solid block of hardwood. And don't worry about these field nails that are sticking out and didn't make it. I used some nails that I bought from Harbor Freight, and a few of them just didn't handle the pressure from the nailer. But it wasn't the nailer's fault. Anyways, here's the 18 gauge nailer firing 1 3/4 nails into the solid block of hardwood. And here's a 16 gauge nailer using 2-inch nails. And as we can see, each nailer did just as good with the solid block of oak, firing each nail sub flush, just as it did with the trim, drywall, and stud sandwich. So besides the instant nail fires, these nailers had no problem sinking each and every nail below the surface of the material, whether it was soft MDF or hardwoods. As for the way it felt with each nailer, well, they were both about the same, as they both hit very hard, and there's a tiny bit of recoil with the 18 gauge nailer, and it's a lot more noticeable on the 16 gauge model. It's probably a bit more recoil than I've experienced with other cordless nailers, but not by much, and it's not that bad at all. Although each shot feels mechanical and it doesn't feel as smooth like what you would expect with a pneumatic nailer. And like most nailers out there, these M18 Fuel Nailers also have a bump fire mode for rapid fire shots. This way you can hold down the trigger and fire the gun upon contact with the material to speed up shots. I feel that this is where these M18 Fuel Nailers shine, as bump firing doesn't give you much time to hold on tight, but yet it still offers consistent sub-flush bump firing with each shot. The heavy-hitting M18 Fuel Nailers make bump firing very easy, and I don't have to press the nailer into the material as hard as I would with other nailers, and it lets me fire each shot single-handed with consistent results. And every one of these shots is right below the surface. For example, under the same test with hardwoods, I had a hard time getting nails sub-flush when bump firing single-handed with the rigid nailers. So over here we got, let's see, I got one that was sub-flush and then about, let's say 4 or 5 that are above the surface of the wood. The only way for me to get consistent results with the rigid nailer was to use both hands when bump firing into hardwoods under the same test. Now we'll do the same thing with both hands. Sub-flush, sub-flush. So every shot was sub-flush when I was holding with both hands. But under the same test, single-handed, each shot is sub-flush when bump firing with the Milwaukee M18 nailer. 4 shots, all sub-flush. One thing I didn't like about the M18 nailers when set to the bump fire mode, and it was the same on both models that I tested out, was that many times they would time out too soon. What I mean by timing out is that when I'm set to the bump fire mode and holding down the trigger, I can get a few quick shots, such as when I'm nailing the trim onto the stud. Then I move over to the next set of shots to the following stud, and the nailer times out and stops shooting. To get it back to work, just release the trigger and press and hold it again, and it starts working again as normal. But as soon as I pause again, it stops working. Normally on other nailers, the bump fire mode works as long as you press and hold the trigger. But that's just not the case with the Milwaukee nailers. And it actually gets to be a bit annoying if you prefer using the bump fire mode such as I do. I don't go nuts and shoot nails like crazy when I'm in the bump fire mode. I'll place a couple of nails at a time, then I'll move over to the next section and trim, and lay a couple of more nails, then move over to the next section, and lay a couple more nails, and so forth, all while holding the trigger the entire time that I use the bump fire mode. I noticed that the rigid nailers also time out if you wait too long in between shots in the bump fire mode. But because it takes a good while of inactivity to time out, I didn't say anything in the review for those models. But the timeout on the M18 nailers was very noticeable, and it can get in the way. I also wanted to mention that the timeout that I noticed in the bump fire mode with these new nailers was not the same thing as thermal shutdown, or otherwise known as overheating. The reason the timeout that I noticed wasn't overheating was because, first of all, I wasn't going fast enough for the tool to shut down and overheat. And the second reason is that these M18 tools, when they overheat, the batteries prevent you from using the tool until several minutes later when the batteries or the tools cool off. And when I did use the tool and they would time out, I could still keep on going just by letting go of the trigger and then pressing the trigger again and holding it, which would restart the bump fire mode. On a side note, thermal shutdown or overheating can happen to these new Milwaukee nailers. But before you guys get all upset, you have to remember two things, which is, first of all, thermal protection is there to protect the tool and to extend the life of the tool. And the second reason is that nobody moves at a lightning fast pace. When installing any kind of trim, workers will place a few carefully placed shots, then they'll move on to the next section, which could be several seconds later, and then place another few carefully placed shots. Then they might pick up a piece of trim, measure, mark, and cut that piece, then install it, place another few shots, move over to the next section, and then place another few shots, and so forth. So it's not really that fast. It's not a bazillion nail fires at a time. And if you did work that fast, then there's no doubt you're going to be hitting the thermal shutdown all the time. Another negative that I noticed with either nailer was that on occasion the nailers leave an overlapping double mark when shooting one-handed. Just so you can see, here's the 16 gauge Milwaukee model. And there's a double shot right there. And now let's take a look at the 18 gauge model. The first shot wasn't as obvious, but you can see it on the second shot. It looks like the nail is right here, and you got a ghost shot right here. Now let's take a look at the rigid 16 gauge model, just to compare. And with the rigid 16 gauge, it just leaves one square where the nail went into. So I'm not sure why either nailer does this, but like I showed you before, this isn't something that I noticed with other nailers. So this is something to look out for if you're doing fine finish work, and it'll be more noticeable to touch up if you stain your trim rather than use paint. And as far as driving depth performance goes, I was able to get consistent results with both of these nailers when driving nails directly straight into the material. I noticed that another reviewer said that you would get inconsistent results when using the 18 gauge nailer and firing nails at an angle. And I too was able to get similar results, but in my opinion, the reason for those results have to do more with the user and not so much with the nailer. It's very hard to maintain the same amount of pressure with each shot when shooting at an angle. And also the angle you shoot the nailer also affects the maximum depth it can shoot. It's also almost impossible to shoot at an angle with the 18 gauge model on flat surfaces. If you try to go at an angle from the top direction, then you can't, because a contact pin doesn't make contact, and you can't fire the gun. You can only fire when the contact pin is going straight into the material. And if you try to go at an angle in the bottom direction, the magazine gets in the way. You can only fire at an angle if you're at the edge of the material with nothing below it. But either way, the 18 gauge nailer isn't best suited for firing at an angle. For that, you're better off with an angled nailer such as a 16 gauge angled nailer or the 15 gauge model, which feature magazines that slope towards the handle so you can easily shoot at angles. Now going on to their features. They have all today's standard features like the handy dandy belt clip, so you can hang it on your belt as you set up for your next installation, and built-in LED lights to help out in dark areas. One thing I thought was very different compared to other nailers was that you have to turn these nailers on before you can shoot nails. To turn them on, you have to press and hold this button on the back for a few seconds, and then the green power indicator turns on to let you know it's on. And to shut it off, you do the same thing and hold the power button until it shuts off. So remember to do this when you're done using the tool. And the same power button also cycles between the single fire and the bump fire modes. So once the nailer is on, just tap the button to toggle between modes. You know you're in the single fire mode when the second green light is solid, and you know you're in the bump fire mode when it's flashing. So it's pretty simple. The magazines on both nailers have plenty of windows so you can see how many nails are remaining, and even give you number guides to give you an idea of roughly how many are left. They both feature a safety dry fire lockout feature where you can't shoot when you run out of nails, so you don't damage your material with a bunch of empty holes. I noticed that the dry fire lockout happens when you're down to 4 to 5 nails left and not when you're completely empty. I shot several hundreds of nails with each nailer and neither model had any nails jam. All nailers jam eventually, but it's good to see that these models aren't prone to jamming all the time. But eventually you'll get a jam nail and no need to worry, as it's very easy to remove jam nails. First, remove the battery, open up the magazine and remove the remaining nails. Then flip open the top latch to expose and pull out the jam nail. Then close it back up, put your nails back in, close the magazine, install the battery, and you're ready to get back to business. One thing I didn't like about the 16 gauge angle nailer was that it has a funky way of installing and removing nails. Instead of the magazines on other models where you open the magazine and it stays in place so you can insert and remove your nails, you have to pull down and hold the magazine in place, making sure it doesn't slam shut on you while you insert and remove nails. I also didn't like the fact that it doesn't stay in place so you can free up both hands to insert or to remove nails. Also, when the magazine is open all the way, this little tab gets in the way and makes it much harder to insert and to remove nails because it causes unneeded friction right here. So I found it much easier just to leave the magazine pull tab down here. Then press this little button right here, insert your nails in place, slide them all the way down. Then with your nails in place, move the magazine tab behind the nails and release. It's a bit of a hassle, but luckily you don't have to deal with this mess on the 18 gauge model. Just look at how simple it is to reload on the M18 Fuel 18 gauge nailer. Just open up the magazine and notice how it stays in place. Insert your nails, then close the magazine in place. You can also adjust the nail depth of each nailer by turning the depth knob so you can leave the nails flush or sub-flush. And unlike the Ryobi or rigid nailers, there is no option on the Milwaukee nailers to increase or decrease the nail driving force, so it's always set to the max. So all the nailers can be purchased either as kits with one 2 amp hour battery, the charger, and a tool bag, or as bare tools by themselves. And I left you guys a price for each bare tool in the kit at the beginning of this video in the specification section if you guys are curious of how much they're going to drain your wallet. I'm glad that Milwaukee included compact batteries to keep the overall weight down of the tool, because to tell you the truth, cordless nailers are way heavier than similar pneumatic nailers. And you'll feel the weight of the tool if you're not used to working with cordless nailers, especially if you're going to be doing lots of overhead work. And these Milwaukee nailers are in line with what other cordless nailers weigh. Make sure to check out the specification section at the beginning of this video to check out all the stats on these nailers if you want to know what each of these nailers weigh. But even though these Milwaukee nailers are considered heavy compared to similar pneumatic nailers, their weight is actually not that bad. Especially when you consider that everything needed to run the nailer is on the nailer itself, such as the piston, the motor, and the battery. Try hauling around a pneumatic nailer with tens of feet of hoses and the air compressor itself on one arm, and then tell me how heavy these cordless nailers are. One thing that I did like a lot about these new nailers are that they're not as bulky as most cordless nailers out there. And they actually seem to be less short than some of the competition. You look at some of the other nailers from the other brands and they seem to be getting bigger and bigger. But it's nice to see that they went the opposite direction with these new M18 nailers. Alright guys, I think I pretty much covered everything and I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you guys are a big fan of tools and you want to see more of them, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you can stay up to date with all my latest videos. And also check out my website at www.toolcraze.net. I know I don't post that many videos here on my channel all that often, but I regularly post tool news articles over at the website. And also don't forget to help me out by liking this video and following me on social media over at Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. So thank you guys for watching and I'll see you guys next time.